Hi, in this video we'll be looking at how to use Sharperlight Scheduler, which can be used for a number of things, like extracting reports with parameters, saving them as a PDF or various other formats, attaching them to emails, and also exporting data from applications to the file system, and also writing back data into applications. So there's quite a few things that the scheduler can do. Let's have a quick look at an example of one of the scheduled tasks. So here we have a Actions tab, and we can select a number of different actions by selecting New and then selecting from the type. In this example, we have a query that selects all the companies from an application called SAP Business One. What that does is repeat all the actions in the list, one for every row in that data set. So we're getting the companies in this example, and we're fitting that company into a published report, running that and saving it as a PDF to the file system. This example also shows how to use Excel. So we're overriding the cells in Excel with the company, extracting it and saving that to the file system. The same is also possible with Word documents. In this case, it's overriding the bookmarks with the parameters generated by the query combinations. And then finally, it's sending an email using the parameters such as the company name and the current date and time. And down the bottom here, we're attaching the files to the email. This example uses a HTML template so that the email looks pretty. So here's our attachments, and there's the body of the email with logos. On the next tab we have our triggers, so we can define when the scheduled job is to run, and usually these are based on times, but they can also be based on Windows events. And finally we have the log history, so we know when the task was run and if there were any errors. This particular example also has an on error, so that we can run another task if an error occurs with this scheduled task. In this case, it's running another task that emails out the details to whoever's in charge of the scheduled jobs. Okay, let's have a look at the examples we've prepared for this video. The first example will start off with a simple report that we save as PDF and attach it to an email. Then we'll move on to a more complex scenario, which is the one that I just showed you previously, where a query is used to generate combinations, and these combinations repeat all the actions in the task, passing parameters. In the next example, we'll look at how you can read data out of your application database, create CSV files, compress them, and upload them to a OneDrive or Dropbox location. Then we'll be looking at the reverse of that, where you read CSV files from your file system and write it back to your application database, along with some clear down logic and what to do with error handling. The next example will deal with multiple PDFs that need to be combined into one PDF file with bookmarks. The next example shows how we can trigger tasks from other means. Instead of using a trigger in the task, we can use a web page with a button, and click on the button, and that kicks off a job with parameters. So this example shows how we can enter an email address and then click a button, have the report sent to that email address. This example also shows how we can use log to keep track of what's happening in the tasks and also use them as a type of workflow. Next, we'll look at how to set up Excel and Word so that it can be scheduled, given that these Office applications require an active desktop and will not work if a user's not logged on. And finally, we'll wrap up with security options and setup. Let's move on to the first example, where we want to schedule the regular emailing of a published report. So in Publisher, I have a report called Sales. In the filters of the query, we have a filter called Company. Just remember this, as we're going to override this filter value with another one in Scheduler. On the Page tab, we have a page design where we've created a design that has various graphs and table results. The reason why we're using Publisher is because we can run Publisher or schedule it even though there's no user logged on, whereas Excel requires additional setup. So let's go now to Scheduler and we'll automate the creation of this report on a regular basis. In Scheduler, click on New and give the schedule job a code and group. I'm going to call the group Training and the code will be simple. Next, we'll move to the Actions tab and click on New. From the type list, select Publisher Save As. Then we can move down to the report code and select the published report that we want to run. In this case, it was Scheduler Sales. Under the report code, you'll see a section called Query Parameters. This is where we can override the filter values in that report. For example, we could say company, which is the filter name, equals, and then provide an alternative company name. I'm just going to enter the company as UK in this example, just to demonstrate how we can override those filter values. Next, come across to the media section, and this is where we can specify the file that we're going to save to. Here I'll select PDF, and the output file location, I'm going to make it on this network drive location. The reason why I'm not saving it to my C drive is because I may want to run this on the application server. So if I use a network shared folder location, both the server, the application server, and my client can both see the same path. So this is why I'm using this location here. So I'll just copy that in here, and then I'll give it a file name, for example sales.pdf. At this point we'd normally go to the triggers and define a trigger, but at this point I'll just press OK and we'll get a prompt to say that we haven't defined any triggers yet, but that's okay. Press yes and next, right click on it and select execute. What is a better practice is to specify the default folder location and then have all the file paths relative to that. For that reason, I'm going to take the scheduler folder, cut that and move it over to here, which is the default folder location. So all the paths will be relative to this folder, and if at a later date you change them, you just need to change this one location. So let's come back to our actions. So here we have our report code, we're overriding the parameters in the filters, and then we're saving to the reports folder. And if we have a look at the file system, that PDF has now been refreshed and saved. So let's just open that up, and indeed the company has been changed to be UK. Let's add the Excel workbook now to this selection of actions. So I'll select New, and in the drop down list we'll select Excel. Over here we can browse for the folder, and again I've put it on that network shared location. Here it is, sales, and because I have a default folder location I can remove this so it'll be relative to that location. And then just like we did with Publisher, we've got our parameters. Let's have a look at the Excel workbook that we'll be running. So in this case we've got 3 sheets, and each sheet has a cell that drives the report, and that cell is the company, and of course we've got some dates here as well. But in this example we'll just be overriding the company with the company that we want to run. Here again we have the company. Now if you put a name range on this cell, we could in the parameters list give the name of the name range and then equals the value. But because I haven't done this, I'm going to use the normal sheet and cell override method. Okay, I've entered in the sheet and the cell and then the company name that I want to set it to. And just like before, we can then specify the type of file that we want to create in this action. For example, I would like to save it as a XLS, In earlier versions of Sharperlight, this type of relative folder location didn't quite work correctly, in which case you would have to provide the full path. But I'm using version 4.6.188, and therefore I can use these relative file locations. Below the files we have what sheets we'd like to target. So we can target the active sheet, all the sheets in the workbook, or we could provide a list of sheets. For example, if I just wanted the top 10, I could type in top 10 in here, and then the next sheet and the next sheet. You notice that we have tooltips on the various options. If you don't see the tooltip over the text box, you can always float over the label and get another tooltip there. Okay, let's have a look at the options for Excel. You can see that we can recalculate the workbook using the Sharperlight add-in, and we can also detach the formulas. So if you're sending the Excel workbooks out via email, the recipient may not have the Sharperlight add-in. So in these cases you can detach the Sharperlight formulas. So it will just leave the values in the Excel workbook. But this wouldn't be required if you use PDF. If you're saving the Excel workbooks as PDF, what happens is it just uses the print area that's defined, so you can ignore certain areas of the workbook. Okay, let's have a look at Word. Just as we did before, we can browse for the file, and then instead of name ranges in Excel, we've got bookmarks in Word. So we could, for example, override a bookmark in the Word document. We won't go into Word at this point as it's pretty straightforward. Let's have a look at the triggers now. We come across to triggers and click New. By default it's set to run every day and just a few minutes into the future. So if we wanted to run this at 7 AM in the morning, we'd just change the time and that would be it. Let's have a look at some of the other time options. So if we clicked New again, we could set off 2 triggers. For example, let's do it on particular days of the week at a particular time. So when you do multiple triggers, any one of them can trigger this task. In a more complex scenario, you could, for example, trigger this based on Windows events. And you may not know, but Sharperlight queries can raise events in the Windows event log. So you could run a task that runs a report that uses an expression that, based on some condition, raises a event log, and then that can trigger one of these tasks. So you can in here look at a particular log, source, and an event ID to trigger this task. Finally, we have the history, and here we can see if every time that this task has been run and if there were any errors. For example, here we have an error and we had some problem with the file location. If you want to keep track of all the times that this task has been run, select all. Over here we have on error, which is quite handy, that if you want to be notified if there is an error of any kind, what we can do here is select the task to run if an error occurs. And what will happen is this will be able to receive what task failed and what sort of message was associated with that failure. And usually this on error task would be something that would send off an email. Okay, let's add one more action to this list, which is to email these 2 reports. So I'll select New, and from the list select Email. Like any email, we have a from and a to and a CC list, and a subject and message and attachments. But to use email, the first step is to configure your email settings. In this host list, we have 30 or so of the most commonly used email providers. For example, Gmail, Hotmail, Microsoft, Office 365, etc. If you don't have one of these types of emails, just look up the SMTP settings for your email provider. In my case, I'm going to use Gmail, so I'll select from the list Gmail and I'll type in my account password. So the email will be sent out using this account, but you can show it coming from another email address. For Gmail, I'll need to use SSL, and I don't know the port, but that's okay because it's one of the default lists. It'll auto detect most of the settings. In fact, in the case of Gmail, I didn't even need to select the host. Okay, let's send the email to a particular location. So we enter the to address and the from, and the subject will be sales. In here, I want to enter in the date that the sales report is for. So I'll use this button here to have a look at all the types of parameters that we can drop into virtually any location on an action. So here we have all the task parameters, and we also have system properties, so we can get the date in various formats, and later on when we look at query combinations we can get out the current company or all the row details. So in this case I'd just like to put the date in. So if I have a look at system properties, I can get the month. I'm just double clicking on that and I'll get the year and day. Here's the message box. In the beginning of this video you saw that I was using a HTML template. I can use text in here and drop in various cell references using the reference list. So I'm just going to keep this simple in this example and type in the message. Next we'll move down to attachments, and this is where we refer to those documents that were saved. For example, here's our sales report, so I'll just copy that and put that into the attachments. It's a relative file location, and here we're saving the Excel workbook, and we'll move that into the attachments as well. Here we have the ability to zip these as a single file and also password protect them. Okay, let's press OK, and if we execute that we'll find that the emails will eventually be sent out to our email box. I recommend that you test emails, given that if your settings are not correct, or for example the application server is blocking emails, you'll need to at least test this to find out if they're going out correctly. Let's move on to the next example where we use query combinations to produce a data set and repeat the actions, one for each row of the data set. In this case we're emailing out reports, one for each company. So here we have the date and the company as an attachment to the email. So this company will be changed and sent out to different email addresses based on the company name. And in the message of the email we're using a HTML template where we can pass in parameters and also have branding as well. Right, let's move back to Scheduler and have a look at the example. So this example, we just like before, we have a default folder location so that all the reports are relative to this folder location. And in the actions we have something similar to before, where we have a publish report, a Excel workbook and a Word document, and each one of these has parameters. For example, here we have the company, and instead of hard coding it, we're taking the company from this query combinations data set up the top, and the same for Excel. Let's have a look at the query combinations, which was created by selecting new and then from the drop down list selecting query combinations. Query combinations are driven by a Sharperlight query, so let's have a look at this query. In this case we're using SAP Business One, and SAP Business One has the concept of companies. You can see here we have a number of companies. We want to repeat the actions, one for each company. So I've defined a query here, and if we preview it, here's our list of companies, and here's our email address that we want to use when we're dealing with each company. Just to have a look at the expression here, this is where we've defined the company and the associated email address. I'm using a expression switch statement, but it could have been a subquery to another table to get the associated email address. So here's our query and our email address, and you notice that these outputs have a output name. So we look at the name. This one's called com name, short for company name. I could change that, but I'll leave it as it is. And this output has a output name of email. This is important because when we come back to this, you'll see that the output names are listed in the attributes row. These names can be then used to drive and override the filter values of these reports. So in this case, we have a published report for sales, and we had a filter called company. And here I've referred to the output name of the query combinations to override it. We could type that in, or we could select it from the list. So here we have query combinations, and it knows the names of those outputs. So if we were to type that in from scratch, we would go company equals, and then something like this. And if we had more, we could say, for example, email equals, and then refer to the email. We could enter any number of parameters in here. They're just text, or if you wanted to get complex, you could break into expression logic, so we can calculate the result of a overriding filter. But in this case, we just need the company name. Okay, so that's the published report. For the output file of the published report, you can see that I've put in a reference to the date and the company name, so that when it gets saved, these will be resolved. And if we look at the file system where I've run it previously, here's the date, and it's put the company name into the file name. Okay, Excel is very similar to the previous example, except instead of hard coding the company, we've made the company refer to whatever the current company is in the data set, the query combinations data set. And we're overriding this sheet and cell C7. Again, if there were name ranges, we could override a name range by its name. Here we're saving it out to the file system, and instead of outputting all the sheets, we're just targeting the top 10 clients and vendors in that workbook. And in this way we can have various worksheets that do calculations but don't appear in the final saved report. Just as before, we pay attention to these options here, and because I'm sending it out via email, I'm using the Detach Sharperlight formulas, so there's no dependency on the add-in. As before, we can use Word and override bookmarks. So Word could be quite handy if you've got a letter as opposed to a report, and you would like to override sections of the letter with the client name and maybe the amount overdue and some other details like their address. So we target the bookmarks. Word documents can also have references to Excel content, so you can link those up, and that's quite a powerful combination too. And just like before, finally we've got our email, and in this case we're sending from this email address, but the to is coming from the query combinations, so we're using that to distribute to various personnel based on the company name. Here we've got our subject, and we've peppered the subject with the parameters from the query and a few of the system properties. For the message body, instead of just typing in plain old text, we've used a HTML template. Let's have a look at that file. So here we have a folder called email, and in there I have my HTML templates. Let's have a look at this one. To create the message template, I've used an editor and typed in the HTML. Here we have the message body, and I've typed in the message, and occasionally I've put in some parameters. For example, here I want the company name and the date, and down here I have the company logo. If you use Word to create a HTML document, you'll find that the HTML is a little bit too complex with dependencies on subfolders, so you need to keep this template as simple as possible. Finally, down the bottom we have the file attachments, and we need to match up the file name with what was saved earlier. So this is why we've got the date and the company name in here. And of course we can show those as separate files or zip them up as one attachment. It's not necessary to close off the query combinations with a query combinations end, but I've just done that for completeness. The reason why you may require the end is maybe outside of this loop you may want to clean up some folders or delete the folders, for example. So you can have actions that are outside of these loops. Let's just have a look at the options again on query combinations. So these query combinations can be fed with another parameter, and that parameter may come from here. So tasks can take parameters in their own right. So that can be passed from here and overridden here, in which case it would be a task parameter. Whatever name you give that parameter will appear in this list. But we can have a look at that example later on with the email from the web page example. Here is the maximum number of combinations that are allowed. By default it's set to 1000, but you can override that here. It's also possible to do nested query combinations. So the first one could get a list of companies, and then the next one would get the accounts that are in that company, or the sales customer IDs for that company. Okay, we're ready for sample number 3, where we create CSV files in the file system, compress them, and then copy them up to a OneDrive or Drop location. Let's have a look at the action list for this one. So just as we had before, we've got a list of companies and we want to repeat this one for each company. The next action is a query, so we're selecting a query which is reading a application database, and it's taking its parameters from the query combinations list. And when it runs that query, it's then saving it as a CSV file and also as a HTML file. Probably the CSV file would be more helpful for driving other applications. Let's have a look at the query that's been run. So here we have SAP Business 1, and we're grabbing the sales from the sales table. And just as we had before, we've got a filter called company. So there's the filter name. That's what we're going to override with the query combinations. If we preview that query, you can see here we've got the customers and the amount associated with each customer. So a very simple example. So our loop starts here, runs the query which saves the data as a CSV file with the company name embedded in the file name, and then we loop around here at the query combinations end location. Once we've finished all the companies, we come out of the loop and then we hit this action here, which is zipping all the files in the export folder to a zip file. So here's our target folder, and we're zipping that up with a password. And in the final step, we're taking the zip file and copying that up to our OneDrive location. In the case of OneDrive, you can see I've got a OneDrive folder here where if I dropped files into that, it'll upload those to the cloud. Let's execute this task and see how those files are created in the file system. So here's our zip file that's been copied up to the OneDrive location. But if we come back to our network drive, where I've created up a series of folders, here's the export folder location, and you can see there's our files that were created. Let's have a look at one of these CSV files. So I'm just going to open that up in a text editor, and here's our header and here's our data. Let's take a look at the actions again. Here we've got the query that's creating the CSV file. It could have just as easily have been a publish report that's driving these CSV files with various parameters. And here we can choose the type of delimiter, whether we've got a header, whether we're using quotes, etc. The next example looks at writebacks and how we can read files out of a file system and write those back into our application database, along with other logic like clear down logic. For example, before writing it back, we may want to clear down all the transactions. We'll also have a closer look at how we can do error handling. Let's have a look at the writeback example. In the actions list, we have a query combinations. unlike the previous query combinations, this one is reading the file system. So here we have our products, and instead of going to SAP, we've gone to System, and in the system we've got the ability to get a file list from the file system. Okay, so here we've got the folder location, and I want to get all the files from the Writeback folder. So if we have a look at our shared drive and Writeback, here are the CSV files, and we've also got an Excel workbook here that we'd like to write back into our application database. If I just put in the folder location here and preview the data, you can see that it's picked up those files that I showed you previously. So here's the full path and the file name, the extension, the file size, and when it was last modified. So we're going to use that to drive our writeback logic. So there's the variable names for all the outputs. So we use those to then drive our writeback logic. Here I've added some log message where I can create my own custom log messages, so I know which file I'm processing in the loop. So this will appear in our history. With custom log messages, you can give it some sort of category code and then fill in the message body. And in this case, I'm referring to the details of this query combination. For this example, I've used Sharperlight Foundry to create an application database, and it's done all the writeback logic for me. So I just need to choose that. In this case, it's Project Tracker, and so that's the system we're going to target. And then once we've chosen the system, we can choose the table in that system that we want to target. So in this case, it's the employees table. Once you've chosen the table, if you come across to the far right icon, you can see a list of all the columns that the writeback requires. So in this case, we've got the code, the name, the category, the gender, the date of birth, etc. Now, not all of these are mandatory, but as a general rule, you should try and match the file or the query that's writing back into this system with this list. If there are identity rows, you can ignore those in the queries that feed this. Okay, that's the table that we're going to target. Now for loading the data. So we have two options. We can load the data based on a query, or we can load it from a CSV file. So in the case of the CSV file, I'm going to use the full path to the file from the query combinations. So I've chosen that from here. So there's our full path. That's the default name that was given. Next, we can specify the type of delimiter in the file used and whether there's a header or not. The same goes for the next writeback. So I've chosen the system, the table it targets, and again the file. Now you notice that when we run this, the first row will be the first file. For example, it'll be employees, and then it'll be customers, and then maybe it'll be projects. So we don't want to run customers if the file that we're currently on is employees. For that reason, we've used this conditional logic here where we can skip the action if this is false. For some examples of various formulas, just have a look at the tooltip on the label above, and you can see that if we return true or false, we can say if it's true we want to execute this action, if it's false we'll leave it alone, or even continue to the next action by using exit continue, for example. Let's have a look at this expression in more detail. So we're looking at the file name, not the full path that's returned by the query combinations, and we're saying if it's the employee file, then we want to return true, otherwise false. So this action will only execute if the file name matches this. If we look at customers, it's got a similar bit of logic where only when the file name matches customers to execute the writeback. Let's have a look at the projects writeback, as this one's a little bit more complicated. Just as before, we've got a condition so that it's only executed if the condition is true. We target the projects table. Here's a list of fields that we want to provide, and this one's a little bit different in that the data is coming out of a Excel workbook, not a CSV file. Let's have a look at this Excel workbook. The first row contains the header, and these details here should basically match up with the writeback that we want to write to. If they don't perfectly match up, that's okay, because we're going to use a query to read the Excel workbook. It can marry up the columns so that they match the writeback requirements. So here's our workbook, and if we have a look at the query instead of the CSV file, you can see that it's got a filter parameter here, and we're telling it what location to look for in the file system, and we edit the query. So this here is the filter that we're going to override, this filter name here. So we're passing that in from the query combinations, but just for this example we've hard-coded it just so we can see and preview the data before the task runs. So this is using system, and in the system data model there's various techniques that you can use to query, for example, a CSV file or an Excel workbook or other unusual data sources. So here we've chosen the Excel workbook, and then from the Excel workbook we've chosen the sheet called projects, and we can provide offsets so that it's not necessarily the top of the sheet, but I've left those blank in this case. Because we may run this multiple times, I've set the caching for this data set to 0 seconds. Otherwise, by default, it'll cache the result set for 10 minutes. Right, let's just preview that. If the Excel workbook didn't match up with the writeback requirements, you could, for example, hide fields in here, create expressions, and what will happen is just the visible fields that are in that list will be put into the writeback. Now, the interesting thing about this projects list is that before we run the writeback into projects, we want to clear down the table. So we're running a process that is calling a bit of clear down logic. What we'll do is come back to this shortly and run the writeback and view the results. So let's press OK here and execute the writeback, and the execute is completed. And if we go in and have a look at the history, we can see there's our start and the various files that it processed. So everything went correctly. And if we go to, in this case, the Foundry produced report pack, we can see the data that's been posted back and reflected in the web page. What we'll do now is change some of these details so that we choose a incorrect code, for example, which will cause an error. For example, we only have a set valid list of categories. If we were to choose the wrong category, we should get a writeback error. Here are the files that are driving the writebacks. Let's open up the Excel workbook that drives the project details, and we'll change the details there to an invalid category. For example, if I was to change PC01 to PC0X, which is an invalid code, close the workbook because we don't want to have the workbook open while we're running this task, saving it. We'll come back and we'll execute the task again. So it's executing, and here's the error. So this error, we want to be able to process it and send off an email to notify someone that the writeback has failed for whatever reason. So let's have a look at the event log, and here's our event log, and there's the error with the details about what code was invalid. And if you have a look at the on error tasks, here's the task that we want to run whenever there's an error. So let's have a look at that. So here's the task, and we look at the actions. What it's doing is sending an email to the person we want to notify that there was a writeback error. And over here we're referring to the task that raised the error by its unique code and whatever the error message was. To get the task code of the task that raised the error, use the reference select task parameters, and you can see here we can get the error message and the task unique code. Let's have a look at the email that was sent when this error was raised. Here's the email that was sent out when that error failed. So we've got a simple message and with the details that there was a particular code that failed. I've now corrected the error, so we can move on to the next part of this writeback, which is the clear down logic. So here we have an action that's calling a process in the data model, and that process is called project clear down. So that's clearing out all the projects based on a parameter which we pass in here. So think of this as a type of stored procedure where we can pass in a parameter. In this case it's saying parameter 1, which I'll show you shortly, we can clear down particular project categories. Let's have a look at the data model. Here's the data model that was created by the Foundry in Sharperlight, and you can see that we've got the ability to create processes, and under custom events here we've got a process that was created called procedures. That's the name that I've given this module, and under there I've right click and I've chosen to create a action that is based on SQL. Here's the SQL statement, and you can see what it's doing is going to the projects table, and based on a parameter that we pass in, it's clearing down that table. You can see that the parameters, you can have any number of parameters, and you can accept the parameters in different formats. In this case I wanted the parameter quoted for me. It could be numbers, it could be dates. To get these parameters I've chosen the control tags reference list, and I've come into processes, and then from the process list we can choose the format that we want each parameter. So the idea is that you, for example, if you had 3 parameters, it'd be parameter 1, 2 and 3, but if you wanted the parameter quoted you would choose Q1. If you wanted in a date format you would use D1, for example. So there's our SQL statement, and what's happening here is we choose the product, which is our project tracker, and then from there we can type in the module and the process code that we'd want to execute. And in here I'm passing in the parameters. Because it's a like command in that SQL statement, I just put a percentage in to say, look, I'd like all the categories to be cleared down. Okay, we're ready to move on to the next example that shows how we can use actions to create multiple reports, save them as PDF, and in the final step combine them as one single PDF file with bookmarks. Here's the example called merge PDF, and you can see I've only got one action in the list, which is PDF merge, but normally what you would have is a series of actions that would build up the files before we merge them together. The PDF merge is saved as this file name here, and just as in the other examples I've provided a default folder location, so everything's relative to that folder location. Here we've got the title, and we can provide a subject, the author and the footer. The footer will appear on the bottom of all the pages in the merged PDF document. And then over here we have the file list. These are the files that we're going to combine together to create the one PDF file. I'll just increase the font size here by using the reference list. So there's our relative folder location, we're putting in the date, and we're taking the report which is for the UK, and here we're targeting the pages that we want out of that PDF. If you don't specify this page syntax, what will happen is you'll get all the pages in that report. So in this way we can target sections of the PDF. Over here we've got a bookmark, so we can, for that document, create a bookmark so that users can skip directly to that location. The page and bookmark logic is optional. So you can see here on the second one we're taking all the pages and we're bookmarking it as Australia. Let's have a look at the combined PDF file that was created by these actions. So there's our bookmark for the UK section of the PDF, and there's the bookmark for the second file that was added to this merged PDF. If we scroll down and have a look at the footer, there's the footer with the parameters that we've passed in. So this will be stamped on the bottom of every page. And when we come to the properties, you can see there's the title and subject, author, and other details that we've put in these areas of the attributes for the merging. And there is also an option to also password protect the PDF. The next example shows how we can trigger tasks based on a web page. So it'll use a bit of JavaScript that will call the RESTful service in Sharperlight with a parameter to trigger the generation of a report and emailing it out to the recipient. Let's have a look at the web page. So here's the example, and the idea is that we can enter a email address above, and from the company list email out to that person the report. So we've got a little prompt just confirming what email address we're sending to. So it's going to send that UK report to that address. Let's have a look at the schedule task created for this example. You can see here we've got a group and a code. This is important because in the web JavaScript, what we're going to do is target this group and code. The next thing of importance is the location for this task is going to be on the server, which is hosting the web page. So we call this the application server. We're going to use the current user, and just as before, we've got a default folder location, and this time we've got a number of parameters that this task is going to accept. So there are two parameters. One is the company and one is the email address. In here it's hard-coded, but when the web page is called, it's going to override these two parameters with whatever's been selected in the web page. Okay, let's have a look at the actions. So the first action is we're going to run a publish report, which is called sales, and it has a parameter, filter parameter called company. We're going to override that with whatever's been set on the task parameter called company. Let's have a look at the reference list here, and because we've named two parameters for the task, they're appearing here, so we can select those from the list to override those. So here we've passed in the company to override the filter called company in the publish report. Then we're saving it to the file system in the reports folder relative to the default folder location. Then the next step is we're taking the task parameter called email. Again, we select that from the list here, which is there, and we're using that for the email address that we're sending to, and we're sending from this email address with these configuration details. There's our subject line, and we're using a HTML template again in the file system for the message body. Here's our message template, so I'll just open that up in an editor, and you can see it's just basic HTML with a link that goes out for our company branding. And here we're accepting two parameters. One is the task parameter company, and then we're just putting in the day, month and year into the body of the message. Again, it's better to actually create your own HTML for these templates. If you use Word or something like that to create HTML, it'll be far too complex with external references, which won't work in email. Because this has been triggered from the web, we don't need any triggers here, so I've just created a arbitrary one and then disabled it so that we don't get the nag when closing this task. Then we come across to the history, and you can see here's our history of whenever the emails were sent out. In this example, we'll use the log history to drive this report here, where we can click on a drill link and show the history of when the report was sent out and to what email address. Let's go back to the actions and have a look at the log message. You can see that after sending the email, it's taking the email parameter and the company it was sent to, and also putting the company into the details so that we can filter on the company and just show who received the email and at what time. Okay, let's switch back over to Publisher now and see how this task was remotely called from the web page. Here's the published report, and if we look at the query, you can see that just like in the other examples, it's getting a list of companies from SAP Business One. And then over on the side here, we've got a bit of HTML and JavaScript that's calling out to our service and passing in the details. Up the top here, I've defined a prompt-only filter by selecting Other and then Text and calling it Enter Email. So this is not really affecting the report in any way. It's just something that the user can type in to provide the target email address they want to send to. Let's have a look at the script that's in the email section of the expression. So here I've used a template that's provided from the list here, and I found it by typing in button. There's two templates that will help you generate this script up the top here. The first one is execute JavaScript button, and the next one is using a template, which is what I used here. So I can type anything in between these two tags, and that'll be HTML and JavaScript. And down the bottom here, we're passing in the parameters. So let's have a look at this JavaScript. So it's a button, and on click event, we're running this JavaScript. So the JavaScript is creating a URL address that's targeting scheduler task, and the task that we want to target is sales web email. So there's our group and our code, and then we've got two parameters. Parameter 1 is the company, and parameter 2 is the email address. Let's have a look at the help section of the RESTful service. So what you can do is simply go to the URL address and type in help, and then in the list scroll down to schedule a task. You'll see some examples of the types of URL addresses you can generate to execute a task. So basically it's schedule task, and then the task code, and then the parameters. So parameter 1, the name of the parameter and the value. So this is what the JavaScript is generating. So we generate the URL, and then we basically execute that URL, and then finally we can change the color of the button, for example. Down the bottom here, we're just passing in some parameters like the address of the service. We're getting a user session ID, but most importantly, we're replacing parameter number 3 with the company and number 4 with the email address. There'll be an article on the Sharperlight website that contains this example. Finally, we have a drill to button where we can pass the parameters of the row that we're on to another published report. So this was generated by, first of all, creating the report. So let's have a look at that. So this is going to be a report that uses the scheduler task log history as a data set. So here's the report, and if we have a look at the query, you can see that the query is going to system, and the table that it's targeting is the schedule history. And then once you've got the schedule history, you can then create filters. So the log that I would like to target is the sales web email example. So it ignores all the other logs. The category of the data, which was created by the custom log message, is data, and if I query that, there's the result set. You can see here that there's a filter on details, and I've given this filter a name called company. So if we override this filter parameter with the company, we can restrict this drill to report to just the company that they select in the web page. Let's have a look at that web page one more time. So the idea was that you would click on the button and it would pass through the company details and show the log just for that one company. Let's go back to the main query that's driving this report and look at how we created that icon to drill through to the next report. So here's the script that's doing that drill through, where it's passing the parameters to the next report and opening it up in a window. So that was created by using the drill to option in the menu. So I'll select drill to, and then we choose the report that we would like to drill to. So that's the log drill report. Double click here, press OK, and by default it'll try and marry up the filters and outputs of the two reports. So here you can see that we have a filter called company in the target report, and we're marrying it up to the output called company in this report. If you don't want to marry it up like that, you can change it in this list here. If the mapping is correct, you can leave that and then move up to the type of drill through that you would like. Once you've married up the filters, then you can look at the type of drill through that you would like. In this case, I'd like to use an icon, and the standard drill through icon's fine. And when we drill through, I'd like to open it up in an overlay window, so it's coming up over the top. Press create, and there's the logic all built up for us. Of course, we can go in here and change this logic if required. Let's move on to the next part of this video, where we discuss various setup options, including the scheduling of Excel and Word documents. Given that Office requires an active desktop, it's not going to work if the user's not logged on. So let's have a look at the General tab of a scheduled task. So by default, we're going to use the current user. So this is the user that created the task. So if you're extracting data, it'll use that account to extract the data. We can change this so that it uses the current user that is running the task. This would be applicable if you've created a shortcut to the task on your desktop and you want to use your account when running the task. This is probably more applicable if you're running the task on your local machine and not on the server. So up here we've got the location. That's the location where the task is going to be executed. Using the current user would imply that you've got something like Windows domain accounts. So you've signed into Windows as a particular account, and that would flow through to Sharperlight, given that those domain accounts have been set up and site set up. You can also run as a particular account, but generally you would set it to current user. Now if you were to log off your Windows domain account, the task that you had scheduled would not run. For this reason, there's a run whether the user is logged on or not. So if you want this to run at a particular time and you've logged out of Windows, you'll need to tick this. There is a complication with turning on run the task whether the user is logged on or not, in that if you have actions that require the extraction of Excel or Word, these will not work. They require active desktop to be able to run. That's why in general it's far better to use the publisher and the page designer for generating your reports, as there's no complications with having an active desktop. But what I'd like to do now is explain how we can leave this turned off and still automate the execution of Excel and Word. Let's assume that we're automating this on the application server, so the location is set to server, and we're using a shared filed location so the client and the application server can see the same path. The first step would be to come to the Sharperlight application server service, which is called Sharperlight. Let's have a look at the logged on user details that the service runs as. So here we can specify an account. By default, this is the network account, and this will not be able to run Excel and Word in the fashion that we require. So the first step is to provide a service account and run this service as that account. The next step would be to actually sign into the application server using that account. The reason why we do this is so that Windows will create the active desktop that is Excel and Word will require. The actual steps that we're following here will be on the article associated with this video. So we've ensured that the Sharperlight Windows service is running as our service account. then we sign in to Windows using that service account, and this will create the desktop. What normally happens is you would use something like Microsoft Remote Desktop to sign into the application server. So this creates the active desktop, and you would go to Excel and ensure that the add-in is present. The next step is very important. After using Remote Desktop, instead of logging out, you would terminate the session, leaving the user signed in. And in this way, when the task is triggered, what will happen is the service, which is running as your service account, will execute Excel, and it will see that Excel still has an active desktop. Whenever creating Excel and Word scheduled tasks, I'd recommend that you actually test them. So you would remote in using the service account, you would create the task, and you would set the trigger time to something in the near future. Then terminate the remote session, and after it's executed, check the file system and also the event log to see if it's actually executed. Next, I'd like to explain some of the technical details of how Scheduler is working. Whenever you schedule a task and create triggers, these triggers are created in Microsoft Task Scheduler under a folder called Sharperlight. Here we can see a list of tasks triggers, and there's the code for the report, and then you've got the timing for those triggers in here. The creation of these triggers requires the appropriate permissions. So when you're creating your task, if you don't have appropriate permissions to create these triggers, you'll be asked to re-sign in with higher privileges, and you'll be prompted to do so. Let's move on to security options and setup. Let's go to Site Setup, where we can control how users interact with Scheduler. If we come into Product Settings and System, you can see that there are some options for controlling how users interact with scheduled jobs on the server. You may want to restrict users to just scheduling jobs on their local PC, in which case you would turn this to false. You can also control whether they're allowed to run batch files, and even the folder locations that the application server is allowed to see. So in the examples I've shown in this video, there was a shared folder that the application server and the clients could interact with. So we could restrict all file access to just that folder. If we come down to user groups, you can see that we've got control over whether someone in that group is allowed to use the schedule or not. So by setting that to false, anyone in that group would be denied access to Scheduler. As for licensing, the minimum requirement is at least 5 users before Scheduler can be used. Before closing this video, let's have a look at some of the other options for creating tasks in Scheduler. If we're in Publisher and we were to go to a report, you can see that here that we've got the ability to cache the report. Now normally this caching is done just in time, so if the data for this report is more than a day old, for example, you can have the data refreshed just in time. But there is also the ability to schedule that. So if we click on New here, what will happen is it will automatically create a job to refresh that cache for published reports. This is used when the data behind that report may take some time to generate. You can see it's created a task automatically for us, and the action automatically targets the publisher cache. The same is possible with materialized queries, where you can build up various data sets and warehouse them and have those data sets refreshed based on some scheduled event. So here we have a table out of SAP at SAP. It could be any system at all, and we'd like this periodically refreshed. So we'll edit this, and if we go to the Schedule tab and click on New, it will automatically create the scheduled task with the action, which is targeting this materialized query table, and then by default it will create a daily event where this will be triggered early in the morning. So in closing, you can see that Scheduler can be used for quite a number of things, including reports, emailing, processing of files, writebacks, etc. There is special setup required for the automation of Excel and Word, which can be done with a logon that's left, which can be done with an account that's left logged on the application server, or even a dedicated VM, or even a dedicated VM that's been set up for just the automation of Excel and Word.